Howdy readers, I'm Jason, this is Chapter and Verse, and tonight I will be doing the literary fiction book tag. This tag was created by my friend Jasmine, whose channel is called Jasmine's Reads. I was tagged in the original video. It has been getting quite a bit of airplay, it seems to me. I've seen a number of people do the tag, and also some kind of commentaries on the nature of the tag. So question one, how do you define literary fiction? All right, so let me start by saying that I don't look at literary fiction as a genre per se. And I understand that that there is, or that there can be, a kind of implied or suggested snobbery to the phrase literary fiction, but I don't mind that. You know, if people want to feel like I'm being a little hoity-toity because I describe most of what I read as literary fiction, that's fine. There are real, substantive, significant differences between, for instance, the work of writers ranging from Charles Dickens to Alice Munro to Flannery O'Connor. There's real difference between the prose and artistry of writers like that and someone like Michael Crichton, for instance. I really enjoy the books of Michael Crichton, most of them. There's a couple of them that I really can't stand, but I would never in a million years call the books of Michael Crichton literature. I think they're good at what they do, but Michael Crichton's fiction, as well as writers like Clive Cussler and Dan Brown, I would never classify it as literary fiction. So literary fiction, as I see it, is fiction that puts a premium on artistry. It is fiction that is attentive to language and its possibilities. There's often a kind of playfulness in literary fiction, but even when there isn't playfulness or experimenting going on with the prose itself, the language tends to feel heightened somehow. You get the sense that sentences have been polished by the writer. And literary fiction is also fiction that looks at story and plot as vehicles to explore human dynamism rather than as ends in themselves, right? The stories and plots aren't the most important thing, more often than not, in literary fiction. It is what is discovered about the characters, about the writer, him or herself, about the readers as they move their way through the book. What is discovered in those figures, in those hearts, in those minds, via the moving through the story or the plot. And language is usually the thing in literary fiction that reveals those discoveries, because writers of literary fiction tend to choose their words really carefully, right? Literary fiction often has the precision and the mindfulness in its prose that we see in the best poetry. What I would call general fiction does not do that. Michael Crichton probably could have cared less about choosing exactly the right word. The story was everything for Michael Crichton. It was the end in itself. It is the end in itself for Dan Brown. But with literary fiction, plot and story are serving something more. Number two, name a literary fiction novel with a brilliant character study. And for that, I am going with one of the very first books that I ever showed on my BookTube channel. And that is Raising Holy Hell by Bruce Olds. This is a novel about John Brown, who was the man, I want to say, didn't Abraham Lincoln describe him as the spark that started the Civil War? I seem to remember that from something I read. Or maybe it was from the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War. But John Brown was a religious zealot who was absolutely possessed with the idea that God had passed the gauntlet that was ending slavery to him. There's a scene in this book where John Brown and his sons, I believe, take broadswords that had been passed down in their family over generations. They take broadswords and they show up on the porch of a slave owner in the middle of the night and knock on his door and hack him to pieces on his porch. It's an intense novel. John Brown was a very intense man, and I love this this painting of John Brown. I was at a beer festival here in Casper recently, and you walk around, you sample all these beers from all these different breweries, and then you give your token to your favorite one. And then whoever wins to decide on the charity that the monies collected were donated to. And so my friend Dan and I were walking around and sampling beers, and we came upon, I think it's Wichita Brewing Company, who was up here from Kansas. And their logo has this image of John Brown on it. I gave them my token for that reason only. The beer was good. The beer was really good, actually. It was one of the better ones I had tried. But they got my token because they had John Brown on their label, which I just loved. And then they probably thought it was incredibly strange and geeky that when I approached them, I knew who the figure was. Number 3, name a literary fiction novel that has experimental or unique writing. It's not so much the writing itself as the style of the book, but that is The Mysterious Flame of Queen Loanna by Umberto Eco. This is a novel that is part novel, part graphic novel. It's about a man with amnesia, a very bookish man with amnesia. And as he is recovering his memories, they take the form in the book of graphic novel panels. And it's pretty brilliant. It's a great book. Number 4, name a literary fiction novel with an interesting structure. And for that, I'm going to choose The Night Watch by Sarah Waters. So this book is told in 3 sections. It's about World War II, London during World War II to be specific, and it moves backwards in time. I think it starts in 1947 and then moves back to 1944 and then to 1941. And when many writers do that, there seems to be no real point to it. But at the end of the 1944 section, because we already know what the fates of these characters are, because we've read about them in 1947. The ending of the 1944 section and how she writes it, what it reveals and what it conceals in the characters, from the characters, is devastating. It's breathtaking writing. I still remember when I read the last page of that 1944 section, I put the book down just try to process what I had read, the enormity and the power and just the absolute sadness of what I had just read. Sarah Waters is fabulous, and this may be her best book. Number 5, name a literary fiction novel that explores social themes. And for that, I'm choosing Waterline by Ross Raisin. This is a book that when I read it, I gave it 4 stars, and within a month I had thought so much about it and had been so haunted by it, I raised my rating to 5 stars. This is a novel about how one can become homeless, how one can be driven to or find himself kind of lost on the margins of society. And so when you hear people, and we all hear them on occasion, who prattle on about how people who are homeless are just lazy and they don't want to work, etc., go out and buy them a copy of this book, and hopefully it will shut them up, because that is a position that is taken by privileged people who are in profound ignorance of what people who are actually homeless have gone through. And all of their situations are different, obviously, but Waterline is a brilliant dissection of how a person can be brought low by grief and by shame. And it's a fabulous, fabulous book. Let's see, number 6. Name a literary fiction novel that explores the human condition. The human condition is a big phrase. It's a big idea. I like to think that it is a phrase that encompasses the totality of life. And because that's how I see it, there's really only one book I can choose for this. And that is Sigrid Undset's Kristen Lavransdatter trilogy, translated by Tina Nunnally. This follows the story of the title character from girlhood through the end of her life. Her life as a wife, as a mother, in, I think it's 14th century Norway. And this is one of the very best books I have ever read. Jay Shea, the wonderful Jay Shea, read this sometime in the last year. I can't remember when it was exactly. And loved it deeply as well. And did at least one, if not numerous, really terrific, insightful, moving videos about his experience reading this book. So I will link at least one of those videos in the description box below. Name a brilliant literary hybrid genre novel. And so the genre I chose for this is the Western. And the best work of literary fiction that I have read in the Western genre would be The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford by Ron Hansen. It's a terrific book. I mean, you want to talk about beautiful writing, beautiful prose, really just careful, rich, loamy prose. This book has it. And it was also adapted into what may be the best film of the 21st century, directed by Andrew Dominik and starring Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck. If it's not the best film of the 21st century, I would say it's in the top 3. So anyhow, yeah. The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford. And then the last question is, what genre do you wish was mixed with literary fiction more? And for that, I would probably say horror. I don't read a lot of horror, but I do really love horror, especially in cinema. And when I say that, I should clarify that I think most horror films suck. But there have been a rash of really terrific horror films over the last 5 or 6 years. Films including Mother and The Witch, Midsommar, which just came out. Hereditary, from the same director as who made Midsommar. The Babadook, some really great horror films. But I haven't read tons of horror. I've read a few Stephen Kings. I've read Let the Right One In by, John Lindquist, I think is how it's pronounced. But I don't know that I've really read any contemporary horror that feels literary in the sense of, like I said, of language and revelation about character and about who we are as people being more important than the stories themselves, than getting from point A to point B to point C to point D. So I'd say horror for that. And then finally, tag some people. Gosh, I'm not sure who I'd really love to see do this, who hasn't already done it, I suppose. Although I'm curious about everybody's definitions of literary fiction, because all of our definitions are going to be different. And I think that's kind of part of the point and part of the beauty of talking about literary fiction as a style or as a category or as a genre, however we want to frame it. I love the fact that we all come to it differently and expect different things from it. You know, when we look at fantasy, or we look at westerns, or we look at science fiction, we all have a reasonably clear idea of what we're going to get. But I'll be the first one to say as well that there is literary fiction abounding in all of those genres. I will list below some examples of novels that I feel like straddle both of those worlds, right? Literary fiction and more kind of neatly defined genre fiction, really nimbly. I will try to remember to put the titles of some of those below. But anyhow, yeah, so as far as tagging people, if you're at all interested in this tag, I know this is a cop-out and I rarely do this. I really do like tagging individuals, but if you're interested in this at all, please do it. I, for one, would love to know what your answers to these questions are, and I would love to know how you decide what is and what is not literary fiction for yourself. So I look forward to some more of these videos. Thanks, Jasmine, for tagging me, and this was fun. This was a lot of fun, actually. So I will see you guys again in another video very soon. Adios.